The inscription had been wrong for 400 years, and Dr. Callum Wren was the first person to notice. Not wrong in the way that translations drift when they pass through enough hands: a softened verb, a swapped pronoun, a metaphor flattened into something that reads cleaner on a grant application. This was wrong in a way that made him set down his coffee, lean back in his chair, and stare at the hollow projection of the Vareth nave's northern wall as if the wall itself had just insulted him. "That's not a possessive," he said aloud to no one. The research bay was empty at this hour, 3 in the morning station time. The overhead lights had dimmed to their night cycle, casting the bay in a pale blue wash that turned his notes into shadows and made the hovering glyph projections look more solid than anything else in the room. He pulled the original high-resolution scan closer, zoomed in on the glyph cluster at the 16th line of the northern wall inscription, the section that every published translation rendered as "the builders who sealed this hall entrusted its silence to the worthy." A clean, reverent sentence, the kind of thing that looked good in academic papers and museum placards. It had appeared in 37 peer-reviewed publications over the last century, always with the same rendering, always treated as the inscription's thesis statement. 3 languages had borrowed the phrase as a proverb. A Tessarene poet had used it as an epigraph. Callum had read all 37 publications. He had read the 12 that preceded them, going back to the first contact survey team that had entered the Vareth nave 218 years ago. He had read the handwritten margin notes of Dr. Alen Toravas, the Tessarene xenolinguist who had produced the first working translation, and who was still cited as the definitive authority, despite having died 160 years before Callum was born. He had read Toravas's personal correspondence, preserved in the Tessarene Imperial Archive, where the linguist had confided to a colleague that certain glyphs resist clean reading, but that the context made the possessive the only viable interpretation. Toravas had been careful, thorough, brilliant by every measure that mattered, and wrong. The glyph they all translated as the possessive marker, the small, angular symbol that turned builders into builders who, was not a single mark. It was a ligature. 2 symbols compressed into one, fused by the carver's hand in a way that looked like a single glyph at standard resolution, but separated into distinct shapes when you adjusted the scan's depth filter to read the chisel depth at the sub-millimeter level. The bottom half was the possessive. The top half was something Callum had seen only twice before in the entire Vareth corpus, a conditional marker, a grammatical operator that changed the meaning of everything after it from a statement to a contingency. The sentence wasn't, "The builders who sealed this hall entrusted its silence to the worthy." It was, "The builders sealed this hall until the one whose blood is written returns." Callum sat with that for a long time. The station hummed around him. The hollow projection rotated slowly in its cradle, casting violet light across the ceiling. He thought about calling Dr. Chandri Patel, the expedition's linguistics lead. He thought about flagging it in the shared annotation system so the morning shift would see it. Instead, he closed the annotation system, locked his terminal, poured a fresh cup of coffee from the bay's ancient dispenser, and went back to the beginning of the inscription. He started reading every glyph again, one at a time, checking every ligature, every chisel depth, every assumed possessive. Because if this one was wrong, if a fundamental glyph had been misread for 400 years and built into the bedrock of every subsequent translation, then others might be too. And if others were wrong, then nobody actually knew what the walls of the Vareth nave said. By sunrise, he had found 6 more. The Vareth nave was the largest intact pre-compact structure ever discovered. It occupied the interior of a mountain on Vareth 3, a temperate world in a system that had no indigenous sentient species, no colonies, and no recorded history of visitation by any known civilization. The first survey team had found it by accident. A geological scan for mineral deposits had returned a void anomaly too regular to be natural. and when they drilled through the mountain's western face, they broke into a vaulted hall that stretched 400 meters from end to end, and rose 60 meters to a ceiling of fitted stone blocks so precisely joined that a blade could not be inserted between them. The hall was empty. No furniture, no machinery, no remains, no biological traces, no atmospheric residue that could be dated or sourced. Only the walls, covered from floor to ceiling in carved inscriptions in a language that matched nothing in any database, and a single structure at the hall's far end. A raised platform of dark stone, 2 meters high, 10 meters wide, shaped like a lectern or an altar, with a smooth, featureless surface that reflected light without marking. In 2 centuries, no one had found a seam in that surface. 43 separate teams had scanned it with everything from ultrasonic imagers to neutron probes to graviton mapping arrays. Every reading said the same thing: solid stone, all the way through. The platform had been catalogued, measured, core-sampled, spectrally analyzed, and ultimately dismissed as a ceremonial centerpiece, impressive, ancient, inert. For those 2 centuries, the nave had been studied, mapped, sampled, debated, and argued over by the finest minds the compact could field. 3 permanent research stations had been established on Vara 3. Generations of scholars had spent entire careers inside the mountain, cataloging glyphs, analyzing stone composition, running spectral analyses on the faint energy traces that instruments detected deep within the walls, traces so faint that half the research community considered them instrument artifacts, and the other half considered them the most tantalizing evidence of dormant technology in the archaeological record. 41 doctoral dissertations had been written about the nave, in 11 languages, across 6 species. 9 of them disagreed with each other on basic grammatical points. All 9 agreed on the foundational translation that Torovas had established. The consensus held. The inscriptions were a record of construction, a monument to the builders, whoever they had been. The unknown civilization that had carved this hall into a mountain left no other trace anywhere in the galaxy, and vanished so completely that even their name was a scholarly invention, the Varath builders. Nobody knew what they had called themselves, or why they had carved a hall into a mountain on a world that no one had any reason to visit, or why they had filled its walls with text, and then disappeared so thoroughly that not even a potsherd or a bone remained to mark their passage. Callum had arrived at Vara 7 months ago, the newest and youngest member of the long-term research rotation. He was 38, human, born on a world called Drahan's Reach in the mid-trade corridors, a colony world known primarily for grain production, and a university with a xenolinguistics department that was, charitably, regional. His academic credentials were adequate but unremarkable. He had published 4 papers, none widely cited. His specialty was comparative glyph morphology, the study of how alien writing systems encoded meaning through physical shape, and his particular focus was on the microstructural features of carved inscriptions. Chisel depth, stroke order, tool marks, the small physical details that most linguists treated as noise and most funding committees treated as a reason to redirect grants elsewhere. It was, his colleagues frequently reminded him, a very narrow field. He did not disagree, but narrow was where the errors lived, and Callum had built a career, a modest, underfunded, largely ignored career, on the principle that the most important details were always the ones that everyone agreed weren't worth examining. Dr. Chandri Patel read his preliminary findings in her office the next morning, her expression moving through a sequence that Callum had learned to recognize in the 7 months he'd worked under her. Interest, skepticism, deeper skepticism, and then the particular tightening around the eyes that meant she was annoyed with herself for not having seen it first. "You're claiming that Torovas's foundational translation has a systematic error," she said, "not a question." "I'm claiming that the glyph at position 16-7 isn't a possessive. The depth analysis supports a ligature reading, 2 symbols, not 1, And if this one is a ligature, the 6 others I've flagged probably are too. Probably. The depth profiles are consistent. I can show you the scans. Patel set the tablet down and looked at him the way she looked at every junior researcher who brought her a result that contradicted 2 centuries of established scholarship. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of a woman who had seen enthusiastic young scholars mistake artifacts of their own methodology for genuine discoveries, and who had learned that the kindest thing she could do was make them prove it beyond her considerable capacity for doubt. Callum, do you know how many people have studied the Varith inscriptions? Over 200 across 6 species. I've read every published paper. And in all that time, across all those species, with all their different visual processing systems and analytical tools, no one noticed that a foundational glyph was actually 2 glyphs. No one was looking at chisel depth at sub-millimeter resolution. The standard scanning protocol captures surface topology. The ligature separation only appears when you read the carving in 3 dimensions depth as well as surface. Because you think the carvers intended it to be read in 3 dimensions. I think the carvers used a tool that cut at variable depths as a deliberate feature of their writing system. The depth isn't noise, it's syntax. Patel was quiet for a moment. Through the office window, the nave's western entrance was visible, a precise rectangular opening in the mountainside, framed by fitted blocks, with the pale morning light of Varith 3 sun cutting a bright shaft across the stone floor inside. A research assistant crossed the shaft of light, briefly silhouetted, and disappeared into the hall's interior. "Show me," she said, "at the wall, with your instruments. If I can replicate the depth separation independently, I'll authorize a full rescan of the northern inscription. If I can't, you go back to your regular duties and we don't discuss this again until you have harder evidence." "Fair." They walked into the nave together, their footsteps echoing in the vast, cool silence of the hall. The walls rose on either side, covered in dense forests of carved glyphs, the stone a warm amber gray in the daylight that streamed through the western entrance and the narrow slits cut high in the walls. The air smelled of stone and time, and the faint mineral tang of the mountain's interior. Dust motes drifted in the broad shafts of light. Callum led Patel to the northern wall, to the 16th line, to the cluster of glyphs he had spent the night dissecting. He set up his depth scanner, a compact instrument the size of a large book, designed for microstructural analysis of carved surfaces, and calibrated it against the wall's baseline stone density. "Watch the depth profile on the display," he said. "Standard scan first. Single glyph, continuous stroke, consistent depth the possessive, exactly as Torva's read it." He ran the scan. The display showed a clean, single shape. "Now I adjust the resolution to read at 0.2 millimeters instead of the standard 1.5. He made the adjustment and ran the scan again. The display changed. The single shape separated into 2 distinct marks. The lower mark retained the angular strokes of the possessive. The upper mark, previously invisible, swallowed by the lower mark's shadow at standard resolution, emerged clearly. 2 curved lines crossing a vertical stroke, with a small dot at the intersection. Patel took the scanner from his hands without asking, recalibrated it against a control section of unmarked stone, and ran the scan herself. Same result. She ran it a 3rd time, shifting the scan window to capture an adjacent glyph for comparison. The adjacent glyph showed no depth variation, a single consistent carving. The flagged glyph showed the split. "That's a conditional," she said. "That's a conditional. Run the next one, position 23-4. He did, the same separation appeared. Position 31-9, the same. Position 44-2, the same. Patel straightened. She looked at the wall, at the thousands of glyphs stretching in every direction, and Callum watched her do the same mental calculation he had done the night before. If the standard protocol had missed these ligatures in the 16th line, it had missed them everywhere. Every wall, every column. 218 years of translations, 41 dissertations, 9 competing analyses, all built on a surface that was only half the text. "I'm authorizing a full rescan," she said. "Every wall, sub-millimeter resolution, every glyph in this hall remapped from scratch." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. The skepticism was still there, it would always be there. It was the engine of her competence, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded like the first quiet note of a bell that had not been struck in a very long time. "Callum, if the conditional markers change the main inscription from a record of construction to a conditional statement, a covenant, a contract, something with terms and a fulfillment condition, then this hall isn't a monument. No, it's a lock." He watched her look at the platform at the far end of the hall, the dark stone altar that every team for 2 centuries had catalogued, measured, sampled, and dismissed as a ritual centerpiece. She was seeing it for the first time as something else. "And that," she said, "is the keyhole." Neither of them spoke again on the walk back to the station. The rescan took 3 weeks. Callum led it, with Patel's authority and a team of 4 junior researchers who ranged from cautiously excited to openly skeptical. They worked section by section, wall by wall, mapping every glyph at sub-millimeter depth and comparing the results against the standard resolution records that had served as definitive for over 2 centuries. The western wall yielded 11 ligatures in the first 2 days. Each time the scanner resolved a hidden symbol, one of the junior researchers, a young Cathari named Os, who had arrived at Vareth 6 months before Callum and considered himself the expedition's rising star, would lean over the display, verify the result, and say nothing. On the 3rd day, Os stayed an hour after the rest of the team had left and ran 8 additional scans on his own. When Callum arrived the next morning, Os was already there, scanner calibrated, working the next section of wall without being asked. "I'm not saying you're right," Os told him when Callum raised an eyebrow. "I'm saying the data is interesting enough to warrant thoroughness." The southern wall produced 14 more ligatures across the following week. The eastern wall, 9. Each followed the same pattern, a surface glyph that standard instruments read as a single mark, and a depth layer beneath it carrying a second symbol. 31 of the total were conditional markers, the same grammatical operator that had changed the 16th line inscription from statement to contingency. Each one converted a declarative sentence into a condition. The builders entrusted became the builders entrusted when. The hall preserves became the hall preserves until. Statement after statement, monument language after monument language, rewritten by a hidden layer of grammar into the terms of a contract. On the 9th day, Callum found something that nearly stopped the project. A ligature on the eastern wall, position 62-3, contained not 2 symbols but 3. The deepest layer, cut at a depth of 0.15 millimeters, at the extreme edge of his scanner's resolution, carried a mark he had never seen in any Vareth text. He spent 4 hours with the scanner pressed against that single glyph, adjusting the depth filter in increments of hundreds of millimeters, pulling the 3rd symbol into focus the way a diver pulls a shape out of dark water. It was a directional marker, an arrow, and it pointed down, toward the platform. The remaining 12 ligatures were something else entirely. Callum classified them tentatively as identity operators, a grammatical form with no analog in any known language, a symbol that linked a noun not to a description, but to a specific, singular identity. Not a builder, but this builder. Not the reader, but the reader whose identity matches this exact pattern. The 12 operators were distributed across all 4 walls, positioned at precise intervals, and each one was embedded in a sentence that described the expected reader in terms that grew increasingly specific and increasingly biological. The revised translation emerged section by section. The northern wall was a set of instructions directed at a specific future reader. The western wall described the terms of a covenant, conditions to be fulfilled, obligations to be assumed, a responsibility to be accepted or refused. The southern wall contained what Callum could only describe as a biological specification, a detailed set of identity markers written in the builder's script, but encoding information that was molecular, not linguistic. And the eastern wall, closest to the platform, contained convergence language, every sentence pointing inward, toward the dark stone structure at the hall's end, like the lines of a map converging on a single coordinate. The three-layered glyph with its directional arrow was the final line of the eastern wall's revised text, and it read, "Stand here, touch the surface. The hall will know you." The inscription did not say the worthy. It did not say the chosen. It said, with the cold specificity of a lock waiting for its key, the one whose blood carries the sequence. Callum sat with that translation in Patel's office on the 21st day, watching her read it for the third time. She set the tablet down and pressed her fingertips to her temples. "If this is right," she said, "and I'm not yet ready to concede that it is, but if it is, then the platform isn't a ceremonial altar. It's a biometric interface, and the entire hall is a delivery mechanism designed to bring a specific individual to that interface." Yes, a specific individual defined not by name, not by rank, not by species, but by molecular identity. A genetic fingerprint encoded in stone 300,000 years ago. Yes, that's not possible, Callum. The ligatures say otherwise. Patel was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her comm unit and called Commodore Dane. The station director listened to the revised translation with the expression of a woman mentally drafting the most carefully worded dispatch of her career. Dane reported to the Compact's Department of Antiquities. The department dispatched a delegation. The delegation arrived 6 days later. 4 senior scholars, 2 Compact security officers, and an administrative liaison whose primary function appeared to be ensuring that nothing happened quickly. They occupied the station's largest conference room, displaced 3 ongoing research projects from the shared workspace, and spent 2 full days asking Callum questions he had already answered in his written report. The senior member was Dr. Vane Korath, a Dreveni xenolinguist, broad-shouldered, deliberate in speech, with the kind of academic reputation that occupied an entire wall of citations and a full wing of the Dreveni Linguistic Institute. He had studied the Vareth inscriptions for 40 years and had published the most recent definitive commentary, a 12-volume work that Callum had read cover to cover during his first month on the station. Korath's name appeared in the acknowledgments of 26 of the 41 dissertations written about the nave. He was, by any standard that the field recognized, the living authority on the Vareth inscriptions. The second scholar was Dr. Alice, a Cathari epigraphist who specialized in pre-compact stone carving traditions and who approached the ligature question with the focused precision of a surgeon examining a wound. She said little, but every question she asked was the one Callum had most hoped no one would think to ask. The third was a Tessarine materials scientist named Dreven, who spent most of the first day running compositional analyses on the stone at the ligature sites, looking for natural processes, thermal cycling, crystalline fracturing, microbial erosion, that might produce depth variations mimicking a second carving. The fourth was a human historian named Rath Solin, a specialist in Compactera fraud cases who had been included, Callum suspected, to assess whether the ligatures might be forgeries. Korath did not accept results on faith. He pulled up each of the 43 flagged ligatures, overlaid them against the standard resolution versions, checked the calibration logs on Callum's scanner, recalibrated the instrument himself, and ran 9 of the scans from scratch. Alice verified 4 more with her own equipment. Drevin confirmed that the stone composition at the ligature sites was identical to the surrounding wall, no evidence of later modification. No tool marks inconsistent with the original carving. No chemical signatures indicating anything had been added after the initial construction. Solon, after examining the depth profiles and the isotopic dating of the chisel marks, withdrew his fraud assessment in a single terse sentence. These are original. Your methodology is sound, Korath said on the second afternoon. Your instrument calibration is within acceptable parameters. The ligature separations are reproducible. I have verified 9 of your 43 instances independently, and Dr. Alice has verified 4 more. Thank you, Doctor. I did not say I agreed with your interpretation. Korath set his hands flat on the table. You have identified a microstructural feature that previous researchers overlooked. That is a legitimate contribution to the field. But your leap from these are ligatures to the entire inscription is a biological identity covenant. Requires you to trust your translation of 12 unprecedented glyph symbols with no attested parallels in any known corpus as identity operators encoding genetic information. That is not a translation, Dr. Wren. That is a hypothesis dressed in the grammar of certainty. The context supports it, the conditional structures. The conditional structures support a reading that the inscription contains contingency language. I grant that, but contingency language appears in dozens of documented pre-compact texts, and in every other case, the contingency is ceremonial, ritual. When the worthy return, the light shall greet them. Aspirational poetry, Dr. Wren, not a biometric lock. Alice spoke for the first time in an hour. The identity operators trouble me more than the conditionals, Dr. Wren. You've classified them as a novel grammatical form, but that classification rests entirely on contextual inference. You have no comparative data, no parallel texts, no independent corroboration that these symbols function as you describe. You are, in effect, inventing a grammar to match your hypothesis. I'm reading the grammar the carvers wrote, Callum said. The symbols exist. Their positions in the sentence structures are consistent. Their relationships to the conditional markers follow identifiable patterns. I didn't invent them. I found them. You found shapes in stone, Alice said, not unkindly. The question is whether the meaning you've assigned to those shapes is the meaning the carvers intended, or the meaning a creative translator projected onto ambiguous data. The room was quiet. The delegation's consensus was clear. An interesting finding, an overreaching interpretation. Callum could see the shape of the report they would file, significant methodological contribution requiring further study, the academic equivalent of a polite burial. Callum had expected this. He had rehearsed this moment during the 3 weeks of scanning, running the argument forward and back, testing his conviction against every objection he could construct. Korath's objection was the strongest. Alice's was the most honest. And Callum knew exactly what the only meaningful answer was. You're right, he said, both of you. The identity operators are unprecedented. I can't prove they encode genetic information through linguistic analysis alone. Dr. Alice is correct that my classification rests on contextual inference. He let the concession settle, but there's a way to test it. The room went quiet. Even the administrative liaison stopped writing. The platform, Callum said, at the eastern end of the hall. The inscription's conditional language converges on the platform. Every wall, every section, every revised translation points to it as the fulfillment point. In 218 years of study, no one has ever activated the platform because no one has ever met whatever condition the builders encoded. Because the condition was unknown, Korath said. Because the condition was mistranslated. If the identity operators describe a biological signature and the platform is the fulfillment point, then the test is straightforward. Put someone on the platform and see if it responds. Put whom? Korath asked. The administrative liaison leaned forward. That would require authorization from regional antiquities, a safety assessment, biological hazard protocols, a minimum review period of. Put whom, Dr. Wren? Korath repeated, his voice flat. Callum did not answer the way anyone in the room expected. He stood up, said, "Excuse me," and walked out of the conference room and into the mountain. The hall was empty when he entered. Late afternoon, Vara 3 time. The daylight through the western entrance had shifted to a deep gold, and the narrow window slits high on the walls cast precise beams across the inscribed surfaces, illuminating specific glyph clusters with an accuracy that Callum now understood was not decorative. The builders had designed the windows to light the instructions at the hour when they were meant to be read. The golden light fell on the conditional markers, on the identity operators, on the convergence lines that pointed, glyph by glyph, toward the platform at the far end of the 400-meter hall. Footsteps behind him. Patel hurrying to catch up, her voice calling his name across the nave's immense acoustic space. He heard Korath's heavier tread behind hers and the measured steps of the security officers. He did not slow down. He heard Korath call something a question or a warning. He could not tell which, because the hall's acoustics stretched the words into echoes that lost their shape before they reached him. He heard Alice's voice, sharp and precise even at distance, saying something about protocol. He heard the security officer's boots on the stone, moving fast but not running, maintaining the disciplined pace of professionals who had been trained to follow at a distance without interfering. The walk took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of amber gold light on inscribed stone, of his own footsteps echoing between walls that had been waiting for those footsteps before his species had a name. The platform grew larger as he approached dark stone, smooth and featureless, reflecting the golden afternoon light without a mark or blemish. 2 meters high, 10 meters wide, with steps carved into its front face. 3 broad steps, each one worn smooth by time alone because no one had ever climbed them. Callum climbed them. He stood on the platform's surface and felt nothing except warmth. The stone was warm under his boots, the same directed warmth he had noticed in the walls near the inscriptions, the temperature of a system designed for the presence of living bodies. The hall stretched out before him, vast and silent. The far western entrance looked like a bright rectangle the size of his thumbnail. Nothing happened. He stood there for 1 minute, 2. Behind him, Patel had stopped at the base of the steps, her hand on the stone, unwilling to interfere but visibly struggling with the decision. Korath and the 2 security officers had positioned themselves 20 meters back, watching. The administrative liaison was speaking rapidly into a comm unit. Oz had appeared in the western entrance and was walking toward them fast, his scanner clutched to his chest. 3 minutes. His heart ran fast and his mouth was dry. He was acutely aware of how absurd this must look, a junior researcher from a regional university, standing on a platform in an empty hall, waiting for a 400-year-old mistranslation to vindicate him. He thought about Korath's phrase, hypothesis dressed in the grammar of certainty. He thought about the 12 identity operators and their unprecedented, untranslatable, possibly meaningless grammar. He thought about his grandmother on Drahan's Reach, running a borrowed magnetometer over the basalt columns of Cairn Ridge, and carefully recording a signal that nobody else thought was worth recording. He thought about the chain of unremarkable people stretching back through centuries who had each noticed something small and true and had written it down. He thought about his own 4 papers, uncited, unread, filed in databases that no one searched. He knelt, pressed his right palm flat against the platform's surface. The stone recognized him. It did not glow. It did not hum. It did not produce the theatrical display that the stories about ancient artifacts always described. What it did was simpler and more terrifying. It opened. The platform's smooth surface split along seams that had been invisible geometrically perfect lines that separated the stone into panels, each one sliding aside with the mechanical precision of a system that had been waiting to function and had never degraded. No dust fell from the seams. No air escaped. The panels slid apart the way a well-maintained drawer opens, smooth, silent, inevitable. And beneath those panels, all 43 teams that had scanned the platform and reported solid stone were proven wrong, not because their instruments had failed, but because the material had been designed to defeat exactly those instruments. 2 centuries of confident certainty collapsed in the time it took a panel to slide 3 centimeters to the left. Beneath the panels, a cavity. Inside the cavity, not machinery, not treasure, not the preserved remains of a dead civilization. A console, a surface covered in the same glyphs as the walls, but these were not carved. They were projected hovering a millimeter above a dark, glass-smooth substrate, each one sharp and distinct and pulsing with a faint golden light that matched the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Behind him, Patel's breath caught audibly. One of the security officers took a step backward, boot scraping stone. As, halfway down the hall, stopped dead. Koreth said nothing at all, which was louder than anything the Dreveni scholar had said in 2 days. The console had been alive for the entire 218 years of study, sealed beneath the platform, waiting for the correct hand to touch the correct surface, and satisfy the terms that the inscription had laid down in a language that everyone had been reading wrong. The glyphs on the console were cycling, rearranging, forming and dissolving in patterns that Callum recognized the same grammatical structures he had spent 3 weeks translating. Conditional markers, identity operators, convergence lines. All active, all running, all processing something. The identity operators were functional. They had sampled something from his touch heat signature, skin chemistry, something deeper, molecular, and they were comparing it against a stored template, a biological reference pattern encoded in the console's substrate with the same precision that the carvers had used to cut the wall inscriptions 300,000 years ago. The comparison took 11 seconds. Callum counted every one of them. 11 seconds of cycling glyphs and golden light, and the quiet, mechanical patience of a system that had waited longer than most civilizations existed. Then the cycling stopped, every glyph locked into a single configuration, a sentence. One line, rendered in the same script as the walls, but larger, brighter, utterly unmistakable. Callum read it. He read it because he could, because the 3 weeks of retranslation had given him the vocabulary, because the identity operators were no longer unprecedented but functional and proven, because the conditional grammar he had uncovered made the sentence as legible as his own handwriting. "What does it say?" Patel's voice from the base of the steps, controlled but barely. "Last heir of the unwritten covenant," Callum said, and heard his own voice come back to him from the vaulted ceiling, reflected and amplified by the acoustic architecture of a hall designed to make certain words carry. "We have kept your record. Speak and the record answers." Silence, absolute and total, filling the 400-meter hall from wall to wall. Then the floor beneath him shifted. The platform began to descend. The space below the hall was not a vault, not a tomb, not a sealed chamber of artifacts. It was a library. Stacks, rows, columns of the same dark stone, each one covered in projected glyphs not carved but generated, hovering above surfaces that extended in every direction, deeper into the mountain than the daylight from the descending shaft could illuminate. The air was warm and dry, with the faint electrical tang of active systems, and the golden light that pulsed from the glyph projections filled the space with an amber wash that made it feel less like a room and more like the interior of a living mind. The ceiling was lower than the hall above, perhaps 5 meters, and covered in the same fitted stone blocks, but here the blocks bore faint traces of circuitry, hairline channels filled with the same golden light that illuminated the stacks. The entire chamber was alive, active, functioning. It had been functioning without interruption for 300 millennia, sealed in the dark beneath a mountain on a world that no civilization had any reason to visit, maintaining itself with a patience that made the word patience feel inadequate. The platform settled at the base of the shaft with a sound like a heavy lock engaging. Above, faces peered down Patel Korath, a security officer with his hand on his sidearm, the administrative liaison frozen mid-sentence with her comm unit pressed to her ear. Callum barely registered them. The console's golden glyphs continued to pulse, patient and steady, and he understood they were waiting for him to respond. The Covenant's conditional grammar implied a dialogue. A question had been asked. An answer was expected. He walked between the stacks. The projected glyphs shifted as he passed, responding to his proximity the way the platform had responded to his touch, not dramatically, but with quiet functional precision. Sections brightened as he approached, the golden light intensifying from a faint ambient glow to a sharp, readable luminescence that threw his shadow across the stone floor. Others dimmed as he moved away, subsiding back into their patient dormancy. The library was reading him the same way he was reading it, tracking his position, adjusting its display, curating the information it presented in a sequence that felt not random but designed. He stopped at a column near the center of the first row. The glyphs were cycling through something he recognized, a molecular map, a genetic sequence, human, specific, detailed, annotated in the builder's conditional grammar with notes that Callum could read as fluently as his own marginalia. The timestamps placed its recording at a date so distant it meant nothing in human historical terms, hundreds of thousands of years, before any known human civilization, before any known human presence among the stars, before the species that called itself human had developed the capacity to wonder about its own origins. And it matched him, not in the general sense that all human DNA shares common markers, in the specific, targeted, identity operator sense that the inscription had described. This column recorded a particular lineage, a bloodline, a genetic thread that the builders had identified and tracked across a span of time that made the compact's entire history look like a footnote. Callum's bloodline. He moved to the next column. A different kind of record, not molecular but historical. A chronicle of migrations, dispersals, population shifts, traced across millennia in the same rigorous conditional grammar. The builders had tracked the lineage's movement through epochs of evolution and extinction, through ice ages and migrations, and the slow, grinding process of natural selection. And they had documented every branch, every drift, every near-extinction event that had threatened to break the chain. At one point, Callum calculated the timestamp as roughly 60,000 years ago. The lineage had contracted to fewer than 200 individuals, scattered across a single continental landmass on a world that the builders' notes identified, with clinical precision, as the human homeworld. 200 carriers of a molecular signature that a civilization had staked its legacy on, and the planet they lived on was entering a glacial period that would kill 90% of the megafauna. The lineage had survived. The builders' notes did not say how. They recorded only the fact and the molecular evidence, and a single annotation in a grammatical form that Callum could not quite translate but that read, approximately, as satisfaction. The third column described the encoding mechanism itself. The builders had identified a non-coding region of the human genome, a stretch of DNA that did not express as any trait, that served no apparent biological function, that geneticists across a dozen species had dismissed for centuries as evolutionary debris, and they had recognized it as a carrier signal, a place where information could be stored without affecting the organism's phenotype, preserved across generations by the same replication mechanisms that preserved the genes themselves. They had not written new code. They had read what was already there and recognized it as their own. Over the next 6 hours, The library opened itself to him piece by piece. Patel sent a rope ladder down the shaft, and 2 researchers descended to document what they could, but the glyph projections dimmed when they approached the columns and brightened only when Callum returned. The system was not hostile to their presence. It was simply not designed for them. The library had 1 reader, and every other visitor was an observer. The researchers tried everything. They brought their own scanners, their own recording equipment, portable holocapture rigs that could document a glyph projection in 3 dimensions. The projections remained visible to everyone. The golden light was real photons. Not a hallucination, but the cycling, the sequencing, the curated presentation that guided Callum from column to column, that responded to his questions with new columns of relevant data, that built on what he had already read. The way a patient teacher builds on a student's growing understanding, none of that happened for anyone else. The researchers could photograph the glyphs. They could not make the library speak to them. Os came down on the 3rd hour. The young Cathari had said nothing to Callum during the 3 weeks of rescanning. No praise, no objection, no acknowledgement that the junior human researcher had done anything more notable than recalibrate a scanner. Now he stood in the amber glow of the library stacks and looked at the projected glyphs with an expression that Callum recognized, because he had seen it on Patel's face that first morning in the office. The look of a scientist realizing that the field they had entered was not the field they were standing in. "Can you teach it?" Os asked. "The depth reading, the ligature separation, can you teach other people to see what you see?" "The technique, yes. The translation, yes. The platform, no. That's the biology." "So the technique is transferable, but the access is not." "That's the Covenant's design. The knowledge is open. The key is specific." Os considered this for a long time, his eyes moving across the golden glyphs, his expression cycling through something that looked like the 5 stages of academic grief compressed into 30 seconds. "That is the most generous lock I have ever heard of," he said at last. Korath descended last, and Callum understood why. The Dreveni scholar had stood at the top of the shaft for nearly 2 hours, looking down into the golden light, while the others descended and ascended and reported back in voices that ranged from awed to bewildered. Korath had waited because he was not ready to see the thing that proved his life's work had been built on a surface that was only half the text. When he finally climbed down the rope ladder, his movements were careful, deliberate, the movements of a man descending into a verdict. He stood at the base of the shaft and looked at the rows of golden glyphs stretching into the mountain's darkness. Callum watched the man's 40 years of published certainty reorganize themselves on his face. It was not defeat. It was something harder, the recognition that the artifact he had dedicated his life to understanding had not been waiting for his understanding. "The identity operators," Korath said quietly, "they are not grammatical abstractions. They're both. They encode identity the same way a possessive encodes ownership through the structure of the language itself. The builders built a language that could carry genetic information the same way ours carry meaning. And you can read it because your biology is the key. My biology opened the platform. The corrected grammar reads the library. Both were necessary. One without the other wouldn't have worked." Korath lowered himself to a stone block at the base of the nearest stack and sat heavily. "Dr. Wren, I have studied these inscriptions for 40 years. I built 12 volumes on what I believe the builders left behind." He looked up at Callum with an expression that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "I did not understand what they left behind." "Neither did I," Callum said, "not until I looked closer." "No," Korath said, "you did understand. You understood from the first night when you looked at a glyph that 200 scholars had already examined and saw something none of them saw. That is not merely a skill, Dr. Wren. That is a quality. And the builders, it appears, carved an entire mountain to find it." Callum had no answer for that. He stood in the amber light of the library and let the old scholar's words settle around him like dust in a shaft of sun. Over the following weeks, each descent yielded new fragments, and each fragment fit into a pattern that grew clearer and more staggering with every reading. The builders had not vanished, they had not died, they had not abandoned the galaxy. They had become human. Not metaphorically, biologically. Whatever they had been in their original form, they had undertaken a transformation so complete that it erased every physical trace of what they had been before. They had rewritten their biology, encoding their knowledge, their memory, their civilizational identity into a genetic architecture that would persist across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and drift. They had seeded themselves into a species that did not yet exist, and then waited with the inhuman patience of a civilization that measured time in geological epochs, for the seed to produce a descendant capable of returning to the hall and reading the terms they had left behind. The unwritten covenant was not metaphor, it was a literal genetic contract. The builders had inscribed their terms into human DNA, not in the active genome, but in the deep architecture, the non-coding regions that geneticists had spent centuries dismissing as evolutionary noise. The information had always been there. Every human who had ever lived had carried fragments of the builder's legacy in their cells, silent and unread, passed from parent to child across a chain of transmission so long that the concept of ancestry buckled under the weight of it. The console beneath the mountain was the only instrument precise enough to read it. The compact's biogeneticists confirmed the match. 3 independent teams, 3 separate facilities, 3 reluctant reports. The console stored template-matched Callum's genetic profile with a specificity that could not be accidental. The match was not to human. It was to him, to a particular arrangement of non-coding sequences that, when read by the console's systems, produced a signature as unique and identifiable as a fingerprint. Patel asked the question that the geneticists would not. Are there others, other matches, other living people who carry the full signature? Callum had asked the library the same question on his 12th descent. The answer had come in the form of a map, a projection of human-inhabited space, overlaid with markers that indicated the distribution of the lineage's carriers. Most were fragmentary. Partial matches, people who carried some of the signature but not all of it, the way a distant cousin might share a surname but not a face. Full matches, carriers of the complete, unbroken sequence that the builders had encoded, were vanishingly rare. The library identified 2. One was Callum. The other marker was located on a world in the outer territories, blinking with the steady patience of a system waiting for its second reader to find a hall that did not yet exist. 1, Callum told Patel, 1 other, and the library is already building a record for them. How had the builders known 300,000 years ago what specific sequences would appear in which individuals on which worlds in which era? The library's records answered. It was not prediction, it was design. The builders had engineered the conditions, seeded the biological substrate, shaped the molecular pressures that would guide the lineage's drift to eventually produce matches. Not names, not personalities, not specific individuals. Tendencies, dispositions, the molecular infrastructure for a particular kind of mind. Callum thought about his grandmother. She had been a mining surveyor on Drahan's Reach, retired by the time he could walk, and she had kept personal logs of every anomalous formation she found in 40 years of fieldwork. One log described an energy pulse at a basalt formation called Cairn Ridge, a signal she had measured with borrowed equipment and recorded with meticulous care, and that nobody in the family had ever explained. She had noticed something. And her mother before her, and hers before that, stretching back along a chain of unremarkable people in unremarkable places who had each, in their own quiet way, paid attention to things everyone else dismissed. The builders had not just encoded a biological key. They had encoded a tendency, a disposition toward careful observation, toward looking at things more closely than necessary, toward the narrow, unglamorous, deeply patient work of noticing what the rest of the world treated as noise. The covenant's terms, fully translated, were simple. The gift was knowledge, the builder's complete scientific, cultural, and philosophical record, preserved in a medium designed to outlast any physical artifact. The responsibility was stewardship. The heir was not asked to use the knowledge or build an empire or reshape the galaxy. The heir was asked to keep the record, maintain the library, ensure that the knowledge remained accessible to anyone, any species, any civilization, any mind that reached this mountain and asked the right questions in the centuries and millennia to come. The builders had not chosen humanity because humans were special. They had chosen humanity because humans were durable, adaptable, capable of surviving pressures that would extinguish more specialized species. They had surveyed the galaxy, assessed every candidate, and concluded that the species most likely to still exist in 300,000 years was the one that had not yet learned to build a fire. They had been right. On the 44th day after the library's activation, Callum stood on the platform in the nave alone. Early morning. The daylight through the western entrance was cool and blue, the sun not yet high enough to trigger the window slit's directed beams. The hall was quiet. The console's golden glyphs pulsed beneath him, steady and patient. The compact had designated the Varath nave a Class 1 heritage site. A permanent, expanded station was being planned, with dedicated biogenetics labs and a xenolinguistics wing that would dwarf the current facility. Funding applications that had languished for years were being approved overnight. The Department of Antiquities had reclassified the Varath system from Survey Archive to Priority Heritage Zone, and 3 compact warships had been assigned to a permanent patrol corridor around Varath 3, not because anyone expected a threat, but because the bureaucracy required a security classification commensurate with the site's significance, and the only classification large enough was strategic asset. Koreth had already begun revising his 12-volume commentary, starting with the foundational translation that Toravas had gotten wrong, and that he himself had propagated for 4 decades without question. The old scholar worked in the nave's entrance bay now, every morning, running his own depth scanner over the glyphs he had once believed he understood, finding the hidden symbols beneath them with the quiet, relentless focus of a man making amends to a text he had served faithfully and failed. He did not speak to Callum about the revision. He did not need to. The sound of his scanner echoing in the entrance bay each morning said everything that needed saying. Alice had returned to her institute and published a preliminary paper on the identity operators, the first independent academic acknowledgement that Callum's novel grammatical classification might be valid. She had titled it, with characteristic Cathari understatement, a note on depth-encoded morphemic variation in the Varath corpus. It was already the most downloaded paper in the Institute's history. Oz had requested a permanent transfer to the Varath 3 station. His application cited exceptional research opportunity. Callum suspected the real reason was simpler. Oz had watched a junior researcher from a regional university overturn 2 centuries of established scholarship by looking at a glyph more carefully than anyone else had, and something in that had rearranged the young Cathari's understanding of what careful work looked like and what it was worth. Patel had asked Callum what he intended to do. "Stay," he had said, "read. Keep the record." She had looked at him for a long time, not skepticism and not wonder, something between the look of a scientist watching a colleague cross a threshold that no professional framework had anticipated. "You understand what that means. The library responds to you alone. If you leave, it goes quiet. It could be another 300,000 years before the next match. I know. Your career, your life on Drahan's Reach, everything you." "Dr. Patel," he said it gently, "I've read the covenant. The builders didn't ask for sacrifice. They asked for attention. The same thing I've been giving my whole career. The only difference is that now I know why it mattered." She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when Data compelled her past the last of her objections, and walked out of the hall without looking back. Callum understood. Patel was not the kind of woman who lingered at thresholds. She processed, she decided, and she moved forward. The nod was her farewell, her blessing, and her professional assessment all compressed into a single gesture. It was the most she had ever given anyone. Callum pressed his palm to the console. The golden glyphs brightened, and the library below hummed with the quiet energy of a system that had found its keeper. Last heir of the unwritten covenant. Not a title he had earned, a description of what he had always been. The builders had designed the system to find not a hero, not a king, not a warrior or a prophet. They had designed it to find a person who looked at things closely, who noticed what others dismissed, who had the patience to read a glyph at sub-millimeter depth, and the stubbornness to question a translation that had stood unchallenged for 400 years, because something about it did not feel right. The final clause of the covenant sealed behind the identity operators, invisible until the correct reader arrived, confirmed it. The builder's last words to their heir were not a command, not a prophecy, not an exhortation. They were an acknowledgement. "You are the one who looks again." 5 words, written into stone 300,000 years ago by a civilization that had known, with the certainty of a species that had engineered its own transformation, that the quality they valued most would survive. Not strength, not intelligence, not ambition or courage or charisma. Attention, the willingness to look at something everyone else had already seen and see it differently. The willingness to sit with a glyph at 3 in the morning and ask why it didn't feel right when 37 publications said it was correct. Callum stood in the hall they had built for him, in the mountain they had carved for him, above the library they had filled for him, and he accepted the weight of it with the same quiet steadiness with which he had always accepted the work that needed doing. No ceremony, no proclamation, no dramatic gesture. Just a man, pressing his hand to a stone that knew his name, in a hall that had been waiting 300,000 years for someone patient enough to read its walls correctly. The glyphs pulsed, the mountain held its breath, and the record continued.